said the policeman, laughing and folding up his papers. There was a silence, and the blue eyes of Basil looked blindly for a few seconds into the void. Then his head fell back in his chair so suddenly that I started up, thinking him ill. But before I could move further, his lips had flown apart, I can use no other phrase, and a peal of gigantic laughter struck and shook the ceiling, laughter that shook the laughter that redoubled, laughter incurable, laughter that could not stop. 2 whole minutes afterwards it was still unended. Basil was ill with laughter, but still he laughed. The rest of us were by this time ill almost with terror. "Excuse me," said the insane creature, getting at last to his feet. "I'm awfully sorry. It's horribly rude, and stupid too, and also unpractical, because we have not much time to lose if we're to get down to that place. The train service is confoundedly bad, as I happen to know. It's quite out of proportion to the comparatively small distance." "Get down to that place?" I repeated blankly. "Get down to what place?" "Oh, I've forgotten its name," said Basil vaguely, putting his hands in his pockets as he rose. "Something Common, near Purley. Has anyone got a timetable?" "You don't seriously mean," cried Rupert, who'd been staring in a sort of confusion of emotions, "you don't mean that you want to go to Buxton Common, do you? You can't mean that." "Why shouldn't I go to Buxton Common?" asked Basil smilingly. "Why should you?" asked his brother, catching hold again restlessly of the plant in the window and staring at the speaker. "To find our friend, the lieutenant, of course," said Basil Grant. "I thought you wanted to find him." Rupert broke a branch brutally from the plant and flung it impatiently on the floor. "And in order to find him," he said, "you suggest the admirable expedient of going to the only place on the habitable earth where we know he can't be." The constable and I could not avoid breaking into a kind of assenting laugh, and Rupert, who had family eloquence, was encouraged to go on, with a reiterated gesture. "He may be in Buckingham Palace. He may be sitting astride the cross of St. Paul's. He may be in jail, which I think most likely. He may be in the Great Wheel. He may be in my pantry. He may be in your store cupboard. But out of all the innumerable points of space, there is only one where he has just been systematically looked for, and where we know that he is not to be found, and that, if I understand you rightly, is where you want us to go." "Exactly," said Basil calmly, getting into his greatcoat. "I thought you might care to accompany me. If not, of course, make yourselves jolly here till I come back." It is our nature always to follow vanishing things, and value them if they really show a resolution to depart. We all followed Basil, and I cannot say why, except that he was a vanishing thing, and that he vanished decisively with his greatcoat and his stick. Rupert ran after him with a considerable flurry of rationality. "My dear chap," he cried, "do you really mean that you see any good in going down to this ridiculous scrub, where there is nothing but beaten tracks and a few twisted trees, simply because it was the first place that came into a rowdy lieutenant's head when he wanted to give a lying reference in a scrape?" "Yes," said Basil, taking out his watch, "and what's worse, we've lost the train." He paused a moment and then added, "As a matter of fact, I think we may just as well go down later in the day. I have some writing to do, and I think you told me, Rupert, that you thought of going to the Dulwich Gallery. I was rather too impetuous. Very likely he wouldn't be in, but if we get down by the 5:15, which gets to Purley about 6, I expect we shall just catch him." "Catch him?" cried his brother, in a kind of final anger. "I wish we could. Where the deuce shall we catch him now?" "I keep forgetting the name of the common," said Basil, as he buttoned up his coat. "The Elms... what was it? Buxton Common, near Purley. That's where we shall find him." "But there is no such place," groaned Rupert. But he followed his brother downstairs. We all followed him. We snatched our hats from the hat-stand and our sticks from the umbrella-stand. And why we followed him we did not and do not know. But we always followed him, whatever was the meaning of the fact, whatever was the nature of his mastery. And the strange thing was that we followed him the more completely, the more nonsensical appeared the thing which he said. At bottom, I believe, if he had risen from our breakfast table and said, "I'm going to find the holy pig with 10 tails," we should have followed him to the end of the world. I don't know whether this mystical feeling of mine about Basil on this occasion has got any of the dark and cloudy colour, so to speak, of the strange journey that we made the same evening. It was already very dense twilight when we struck southward from Purley. Suburbs and things on the London border may be, in most cases, commonplace and comfortable, but if ever by any chance they really are empty solitudes, they are to the human spirit more desolate and dehumanized than any Yorkshire moors or Highland hills, because the suddenness with which the traveller drops into that silence has something about it as of evil elfland. It seems to be one of the ragged suburbs of the cosmos, half forgotten by God. Such a place was Buxton Common, near Purley. There was certainly a sort of grey futility in the landscape itself, but it was enormously increased by the sense of grey futility in our expedition. The tracts of grey turf looked useless, the occasional wind-stricken trees looked useless, but we, the human beings, more useless than the hopeless turf or the idle trees. We were maniacs akin to the foolish landscape, for we were come to chase the wild goose that has led men and left men in bogs from the beginning. We were 3 dazed men under the captaincy of a madman, going to look for a man whom we knew was not there, in a house that had no existence. A livid sunset seemed to look at us with a sort of sickly smile before it died. Basil went on in front with his coat collar turned up, looking in the gloom rather like a grotesque Napoleon. We crossed swell after swell of the windy common in increasing darkness and entire silence. Suddenly Basil stopped and turned to us, his hands in his pockets. Through the dark I could just detect that he wore a broad grin, as of comfortable success. "Well," he cried, taking his heavily gloved hands out of his pockets and slapping them together, "here we are at last." The wind swirled sadly over the homeless heath. 2 desolate elms rocked above us in the sky like shapeless clouds of grey. There was not a sign of man or beast to the sullen circle of the horizon, and in the midst of that wilderness Basil Grant stood rubbing his hands with the air of an innkeeper standing at an open door. "How jolly it is," he cried, "to get back to civilization! That notion that civilization isn't poetical is a civilized delusion. Wait till you've really lost yourself in nature, among the devilish woodlands and the cruel flowers. Then you'll know that there's no star like the red star of man that he lights on his hearthstone, no river like the red river of man, the good red wine, which you, Rupert Grant, if I have any knowledge of you, will be drinking in 2 or 3 minutes in enormous quantities." Rupert and I exchanged glances of fear. Basil went on heartily as the wind died in the dreary trees. "You'll find our host a much more simple kind of fellow in his own house. I did when I visited him when he lived in the cabin at Yarmouth, and again in the loft at the city warehouse. He's really a very good fellow, but his greatest virtue remains what I said originally." "What do you mean?" I asked, finding his speech strain towards a sort of sanity. "What is his greatest virtue?" "His greatest virtue," replied Basil, "is that he always tells the literal truth." "Well, really," cried Rupert, stamping about between cold and anger, and slapping himself like a cabman, "he doesn't seem to have been very literal or truthful in this case, nor you either. Why the deuce, may I ask, have you brought us out to this infernal place?" "He was too truthful, I confess," said Basil, leaning against the tree, "too hardly veracious, too severely accurate. He should have indulged in a little more suggestiveness and legitimate romance. But come, it's time we went in. We shall be late for dinner." Rupert whispered to me with a white face, "Is it a hallucination, do you think? Does he really fancy he sees a house?" "I suppose so," I said. Then I added aloud,